a lot of talk about the modularity, or talking about how technology can help improve the process of thinking of a building as a product, or as a car, right, or things like that. As well as like the maybe not the pitfalls of BIM, but the disillusionments of technologies like BIM into delivering what was promised or potentially promised, which is that everyone would be able to use one model, right, as a single source of truth, and that would simplify things, that would allow you to maybe print a building on by pressing a button. So those are the kind of things that we talked about. In general, we're really trying to think about, or discussing, could we rethink the entire industry if we started from first principles in a way, and not from like, there's talk about like software, and how software, if you try to build software for an architect right now, will just look like, it'll just kind of cement the practice in which they're currently in. It reflects the culture and the practice in which they're currently in. Whereas if you rethought completely what it meant if you really understood what the pain points were throughout the building lifecycle, you might be able to build technology that could alleviate those pressure points and pain points. And I'm sure there's stuff that's escaping me. But overall, like the focus was thinking about business models through a diagram, and using that as a way to think about things.
So what my table did is we first introduced ourselves, talked about who we were and what some of the things that make us us. And then I laid out this kind of diagram here, which was to begin to look at the architectural worker in its sequence. And starting with that the first step of the architectural laborer is education. And then one of the things people began to talk about their experiences with labor while there's students, both in the summers as interns, and then with, increasingly, which is unlike my experience from having graduated about 7 years ago, people now working while they go to school more often, like full-time, or part-time at an actual practice. So beginning to think about that, then as soon as people leave school, we didn't really get really far. Although the idea here is to create a full diagram of all the issues from the moment you enter school until the moment you retire. As an architectural worker, what are all the things that you're dealing with? Some of the things that became interesting, for example, Phil put risk on the table. Something that other people began to talk about, and as a similar kind of maybe thing that could cut sections across, is sacrifice. What are the sacrifices that people at those different levels, from education, fresh labor, beginning your own practice or middle management at a corporate firm, all the way to like higher management or owner, full-on more owner, are. So some of the things that we began to talk about is the idea of failure and risk. That risk always means that you might fail, and what happens, who can fail? I think is one of the things that comes up. Not everyone can actually fail for many social reasons. The idea of whether validation or assessment, that you're willing to sometimes sacrifice, and that sacrifice becomes very personal. Risk is about value proposition. Sacrifice is kind of the investment that is with risk. Anyway, so we looked at that through that, and then the big picture, and we went all the way to the owner, because we only got through a little bit of fresh labor, is the idea that the owners often are able to bring in a lot of the resources, right? So they're able to aggregate the resources while using a lot of the labor of production from much younger and people earlier on that line. So that relationship of production versus being able to be the one that aggregates resources. So that's some of the things we did. Interestingly enough, one of the things, because I wanted to do the assignment as prescribed, is one of the innovations that we saw here was A-Frame itself. And one of the things that A-Frame seems to be doing in an interesting way, perhaps the lobby also in other ways, is able to create a platform where people with different kind of both interests, ideologies, whatever you want to call it, can come together and share resources. So both things as sharing resource platforms.
So we had the technology workshop. It was very fun. We had Phil in our table, which was a luxury. So we started talking about what kind of things do we actually do as architects in what we learn in architecture school that provide some kind of added value, no, above engineers or other people in the construction industry, other providers. Very quickly, a few very obvious things came up. Like, for example, we're trained in aesthetics to a degree, so we have some kind of understanding of what constitutes aesthetics for architecture. Somebody raised the question of psychological well-being in all of its different dimensions in buildings. So, what kind of technologies allow us to either produce aesthetic value or produce some kind of psychological well-being? It turns out in our conversation that it's related to our ability to communicate, unsurprisingly. Extracting knowledge from experts and consultants. So we're good in meetings and we're good at connecting people together, no? And getting the right information from them quite quickly. So this was the first part of the exercise, which was a kind of mapping exercise of what do we actually do and what are the tools that we have to do that. Somebody then brought up the question of, well, you know, we're also, that relates to the fact that we can gather a lot of very different information and make it meaningful, no, in a kind of workflow. So somebody made the comment that it's a bit like film directors, that, very complex procedures that happen, and there's a lot of coordination involved. So that was the first part of the conversation. Then we came up with this question of, well, what do you get when you combine that with two things? Getting involved earlier in the project. So what would it mean to use those techniques and those skills that we have if you were to get involved with the owner much earlier? How would you, for example, be able to codify their psychological preferences or their psychological profile? And that would be just one dimension, or an aesthetic one is another one. And then Phil threw us into the deep end of big data. And so that kind of changed the whole conversation, because obviously that changes the whole conversation. But yeah, it does, because imagine, you know, we're in a world, Phil was telling us, where everything can be coded, no? And the whole life process of the building in all of its various parameters can be coded and perhaps even forecast. So what would it mean then to connect points A and B, no? What would it mean, for example, for us to be able to engage more directly with questions of psychological behaviorism and use, and more questions that are less engineering-like, so not so scientific, not so data-driven, but questions that are more qualitative, to do with use of preferences, or basically trying to wrap up all of the aesthetic dimensions that are more within our purview originally as architects. What would happen if you applied that to something like the fact that we're going to live in a big data world? And so that resonates, well, it resonates at the level of, does it mean we have to become software engineers? Obviously. Does it mean that we have to think about questions of scale? Does it mean that we're, you know, when you're dealing with so much information and such complex processes, does it mean that we ought to be thinking about trying to design things at a very kind of concrete, at the product type of level, connecting it to this vast infrastructure rather than trying to do the whole thing? So kind of like, how do you slice the thing, right? I think that covers it.
Cool. Are there any immediate questions? Otherwise, we can go straight into some larger responses.
Okay, respond to what you said about the director, the feature film director. It's funny, we actually discussed, that was one of the last portions we discussed, but maybe I can sort of share with you something a little more specific about the roles of film director that is so much like architect, but they do it so much more efficiently. See, I think we had this discussion at the GSAPP itself about the licensing procedures. I was discussing with 5 architects was a panelist who swore that in order for you to be a great architect, you really got to know how to do a storefront detail by yourself. Going back to the director, they have to know every procedure of the entire filmmaking, just like architects has to know every procedure of building process. But film director will never be sitting there as a gaffer trying to hold the lights, because holding a light correctly is going to help him be a better director or make a better film. No, he trusts these hundreds of individual specialists who works with him for him to supervise to make one great film, just like us making one great architecture. So again, I don't know why we're so slow to catch up to other professions who is doing something similar thing that costs millions of dollars. But we're so tied to this tradition. Oh, you have to be good at this CAD, storefront drawings in order for you to do the whole thing. I think there's so much we can learn from, contemporary profession, past and the future. But I think some of the things that we discuss in our group is a culture of our workplace. Again, we have this notion, I forgot this lady who was here. She says that architects don't like to do these kind of multiplicity and these trailer homes because we look down upon it. I think we have to change that point of view. Start changing that point of view in order for us to move forward, right? It's the culture of workplace that's really affecting us as much as technology is affecting us. Do it better or worse.
Just a point that came up in our group about the film director was that in the case of the independent film director, they might be holding the light up themselves.
Yes, yes and no. But you won't be doing you won't be serving your food at your craft truck. But the idea is simple. Like if you see 8.5, by Fellini, right? It's about film director, right? Okay, he makes fun of the producer because oh wait, what do you do? Oh yeah, but sorry, you do nothing. Because he recognizes all these different roles, but he was joking because he knows the importance of a producer. Producer, the movers and shakers. They make sure they get the money. They make sure they hire the right people. They make sure the films get done on time. Why can't architects work with somebody like that? I think in a bigger firms like SOM. Yes and no. There's business managers. But again, we are taught you have to do everything. You have to know every single detail, and you have to do it yourself. I think this notion is completely outdated. Somebody said on the other GSAPP lecture, oh, I relate myself to as a Brunelleschi. I'm like, this day and age, you cannot be Brunelleschi. You get sued at every angle because you are not allowed to make your own tools to do your own building. You can't do that.
They were arguing both. I was there at that lecture, and they were arguing both points.
Yeah,
so it's not only one point of view.
Yeah, but I think, I'm not sure if it's a good comparison, movie and the building.
It's so
Nobody's making money.
So that's the other notion. Because we just talked about not just film, but manufacturing industry. We're talking about Boeing. We're talking about making a $120 million jet versus $120 million typical high-rise.
Well, there's a history of managerial culture which does not exist much in the academic level in architecture, where it does in other industries. So like Six Sigma is a management theory and perspective on how to improve the workplace, right, or improve the process of making products or whatever. And it's implemented at places that manufacture airplanes and manufacture things. And my biggest concern has always been about the fact of the lack of managerial actual education. I mean, I had to learn from venture capitalists about that. I should be reading Andy Grove's book on management. Turns out it's one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I should be reading books about Bill Walsh, the football coach, because it turns out to be an amazing book on leadership. But I don't.
Don't forget Donald Trump's book.
Yeah, that one has its own lesson. But it's these things where you have. Because it's not really about that, right? I mean, the history of architecture wasn't, at least from a disciplinary perspective, not much about the education in that angle. At least in let's say maybe post 70s, post Eisenman area, or when critical theory got involved. But that's probably outside my realm to speak about. I wish there was more conversation going around.
So, I agree and disagree at the same time, because I think that it's important to talk about labor and all of these things. And I think that maybe the condition that you're describing is as a result of architecture being kind of willfully ignorant of those things, because we want to be progressive and radical, but we're also we've up to this point denied a discourse about labor and thinking about ourselves as workers and as laborers. And that for me is like the kind of key shift that actually enables any kind of progressive thinking. And I don't know, but there's also this conversation about Six Sigma, which is really interesting. I work at a giant healthcare architecture firm, and they talk so much about like Lean Six Sigma, and I have no idea what it means, and I've never seen it implemented. I have no clue. It's just this kind of like ideology.
It's because they've got you so busy drawing storefront details.
Yeah, and it's sold. It's like something that we sell to clients, and then they put an innovation consultant, whatever that means, on the project, and like all these other things, and it's this kind of coded language that's never backed up with anything real.
Maybe let George just describe what Six Sigma is, because I personally don't know. So I'm gonna.
I'll tell you like my cursory understanding of it, because even I don't look at Six Sigma as an example personally, but it's basically about 6 different values. I'm going to assume it's from lean manufacturing, a little bit from lean manufacturing, about different forms of waste that you can improve throughout the process. And it's basically like there's a theory, there's a number like 99.99% efficiency is what you're striving for continuously throughout the process. And I guess in the term of a healthcare company, which for healthcare, it's very important that they deliver the product on time, the building on time, right? And they deliver it on budget. The ideology is being served from the marketing department to them is about like, we're gonna do this, we totally believe about efficiency, we're an efficient operation. Obviously, what happens internally is very different. People stay working till 12 at night, blah, blah, blah. But that's because it's just fed as marketing.
Well,
right?
but again, I'm going to disagree with you, okay?
Please do.
Because in the healthcare, I don't know what they got you doing. Somewhere on the,
I'll say they're having me work. I work on a prison hospital in Kuwait.
but I don't know if
The
you're
healthcare in there.
detailing toilet partitions or conceptualizing the problem. I don't know where you are on that continuum. But in the healthcare field, the idea of process discipline and process and efficiency has become very important, because without it, people get killed.
Yeah.
Right? You provide the wrong treatments, you use the wrong protocols, you kill people. And so the Six Sigma process effectiveness culture is starting to become instantiated into the way healthcare is being delivered. And your firm is now starting to reflect those values in some way. Now, either it's bullshit and it's marketing.
Yes, that's my
Either it's bullshit and it's marketing, or you're simply not seeing it somewhere. But there are certification methodologies for certifying that you are working under Six Sigma processes. And frankly, as somebody who just had major surgery last year, I'd like to be treated in a hospital that had Six Sigma protocols, because otherwise they're going to fucking kill me, So this idea of value propositions being about reflecting clients' values, it makes perfect sense. Now whether they're actually doing it or not is a different discussion.
Well, it's an interesting problem that, Kiefer, you haven't seen what it is, but I can imagine that the organization is structured so as your role in that is somehow fitting into that plan. And I think that's what George is getting at with the management structure, is that as a worker, at that scale, you're in an organization that's operating a certain way. And the same is true of us in schools and in most offices that we find ourselves. We're being configured by the organizational values, by their culture, by their goals, whether they be financial or otherwise. But so there's something that architects, I think, miss about. Like you're not seeing it is exactly the case in point. We don't know that that's how some organizations, even very large architecture firms, operate.
It feels like this discussion is actually taking us backward, because every industry, every new industry, startup industry, is trying to get away from the term managers, right? They're trying to use the term leaders. Leaders who doesn't just simply tell and supervise somebody, but leaders that encourage. Leaders who's on the factory field, leading the manufacturers to help to start the whole process. Why are we the one actually going backwards? Okay, we need managers now, traditional managers.
I mean,
You said management, not managers.
Okay, that's a nomenclature.
I think that's also a different kind of ideological construct, though. I think I call it whatever you will, but we live under a capitalist system that prescribes certain roles and has a hierarchy about it, whether we like it or not. And the question is how to, take advantage of it, how to destroy it, how to twist it. That's the question. But if you call it a leader or an entrepreneur or an owner or a manager, it's
on that, I think that one of my favorite lines from Zizek is that, one of the things we need to get rid of is the cool boss, the leader, and ask them to act as a boss. Because once they begin to act as a boss and give you directions, you can either gauge whether those directions are the politics and the kind of conditions of the directions, and you can begin to either rebel against them or accept them as kind of part of the process. That the clarity of having a boss is different in this entrepreneurial culture, and you're getting to something really important. Tries to always kind of fudge that, but at the end of the day, structurally, and this is something that came up in our table, you might call yourself a leader, whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you have the power to lay off someone else, to gauge what their work and their value is, and to either give them more of that or completely take away their ability to live, to like have a livelihood.
So for me the question is accepting that there's always going to be hierarchy, that's just how it is.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Then how do you manage that? And how do you create a system, you know,
And that's
we
a
can
good-
invent a new word, manage, we can get rid of leader. You know, leader has another kind of weird somber.
Hang on a second.
How do you incorporate a system that is optimizing, that is does away with inefficiency, but that doesn't completely devalue the role of workers? That's a 21st century problem.
But it always fascinates me when we as a profession wander into conceptual territory where there are lots of people doing lots of hard scientific work that we're completely unaware of. So I've been running this little project at Yale with our building project teams every year where I get a sociologist, an organizational behaviorist from the business school who has spent her entire career studying collaboration, leadership models, and how people make decisions and how they lead people. And she uses science, actual science, to assess people. We build teams around those assessments. We train our building project teams to collaborate in certain kinds of ways. And this is well-trod territory in everything except architecture, where it's still 1950.
But one of the things that makes it uncharted territory in architecture, and this is where I'm going to really disagree with what you're saying going backwards.
Great.
We have not even gone forward. We don't even recognize what management is in those firms.
Exactly.
And you know, so I'm a project architect. I was first year employee, and then all of a sudden I get responsibility, and I have some new people under me. I'm like third year. Boy, am I manager? But I'm still kind of listening to the partners, and so I'm trying to prove to the partners that I really know my shit. And I'm getting all the work out of these young people. What am I? What am I? And then I get, then I'm about 50. She's a fifth-year person. I maybe made an associate. We just don't recognize. And so if we only had a system of being able to identify management, we could maybe then argue and have labor discourse around it. We're not
That's
there.
true.
Just to fill the point about organizational psychology, that whole methodology. I mean, it's not untrodden territory. Frank Duffy has been doing it for 40 years, but you don't refer to what he's doing as architecture anymore. Now he's a consultant. They were bought by AECOM, and they're sort of hired out to make offices work effectively. And there's studies coming out of Harvard Business School on the exact stuff you're talking about. But I feel like it's not that it's untrodden; it's ignored. I think you're right about that.
Yeah, I mean,
it's there. It's just
the parallel argument, which I agree with, that Peggy's making, which is this kind of unexpurgated model, understanding of how we manage the labor force in an architecture firm. There's a parallel problem where everybody in this room as a professional is going to be heavily dependent on their ability to collaborate and influence and lead and work with and manage others. Yet we spend no time teaching you to do any of that stuff. What we do spend a lot of time doing is teaching you to be a heroic designer. And so one of the things that we're doing at Yale, it's really interesting. Amy Wisniewski, who I work with on this, who's an organizational behaviorist, they have this instrument, this assessment instrument called Decision Making for Leaders. And you go through this assessment instrument and you're put into 30 different decision making scenarios, and you have to decide how you're going to make a decision in each one of these things. And they vary from business scenarios to like you're the captain of a ship that's sinking, and you have to decide, are we going to work together and talk about this? Is it going to be a consensus-based decision? Are we going to collaborate? Am I going to take your advice, or am I just going to tell you what to do? And so there are actual correct answers to each one of these scenarios, and they have a database of 250,000 mostly senior corporate executives and military officers who've taken this instrument. So they've got this huge database. And then we test our first year architecture students. We've done this 6 years in a row, and we compare them to that cohort. And they are completely off the charts in terms of directive decision making. They don't have any grasp of how to work with somebody. In terms of, the data is unbelievably skewed to the left-hand side of, I'm going to make every single decision, and I'm not going to let anybody else, I'm not collaborating with anybody else. It's the weirdest data set they've ever seen, and they've done this 250,000 times.
Why do schools still hew to the Howard Roark model? Why do schools do this? I think you're 100% correct. And when you talk to students, they all say the same thing. What is going on with schools where they hire people who instill this bad values?
Maybe it's because every once in a while you'll get a Zaha Hadid or someone like that out of it, who like becomes basically a commodity, right?
Well,
so there's a little commodification of it. The Howard Roark, there's value. Going back to that.
You have to find your own voice and place as a designer. That's one of our responsibilities as teachers. But we have some other responsibilities we're ignoring. That would be my argument.
No, I think that's true, but I don't think, I think you're right. We teach that, how many Zahas are there out there? Half a dozen, and the rest of everybody's trying to be that. This is insane.
No, it's funny. I have to disagree with that. But I agree with most of your points so far. I have to disagree with that. I think industry sets the Howard Roark mark because after all, it benefits them.
Yep.
It's benefits to have one name, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid. They sell it. But I think a lot of us coming out of school now, in my generation and one before, and definitely come after, it's a collective intelligence, right? In fact, if you look at some of the new firms, the name of the new firms, they sound like rock and robots names, right?
Right. Well, nobody puts the name on a firm. No, it's
nobody
very.
takes credit. Everybody shares the responsibility.
Potentially good.
Industry does not want hard work. They want obedient people who are going to do.
No, that's
No. I'm talking the market. Market. The market wants Howard Roark model. Market.
For design, I don't know. It's like the rock and roller sells.
One way or the other, we've absorbed it. Whether we've generated it or whether it's coming from outside, we've completely absorbed it.
Yeah,
So it's almost moot because we're generating that in school every single
Right,
day.
and that Howard Roark layer of firms that we're talking about is this thick at the top of a pile of all the rest of us doing it.
The 1%, we call it.
This phenomenon has been described, like Henri Lefebvre talks about it as the double image, right? That like capitalism and industry, it's not contingent upon kind of one or the other. It's the idea that you have both the kind of Howard Roarks producing these kind of like artful object buildings, but also a kind of layer of like incredibly mediocre architecture producing really shitty public housing, right? Like capitalism requires both of those things because one says like, look at what you could have, look at what you could be, look at what this is, look at what our society is producing, and then one is producing the kind of unjust reality of the thing. So like, I don't know that you have to pick or choose.
Well, that's very interesting. With today's politics, what you're kind of saying is, if as a society, if we didn't have the 1%, the other 99% would be unhappy.
I don't know that that's strictly true either, but I actually disagree that that's true.
I'm not saying it is, but
I think that I do think that under the current economic system that we have, that like that's almost the two choices that you're faced with. And as young architects, it puts us in an incredibly difficult position because like look at where we we didn't have enough time to fill out this chart here, but the kind of default ending position was owner of a firm. Yeah. Which is like really interesting, right? Because it says that like, okay, we're going to be Howard Roark. That's the goal. That's where we arrive. And like, I don't know that that's the kind of society that I want to live in. I think that's exactly.
Although not necessarily Howard Roark, because for example, that big owner there could be, I don't know, an INEAD or something like that. An INEAD is run through a series of partners. It's more of a corporate model, which is a little bit different than the Howard Roark model. The Howard Roark is a little bit like what I think a lot of us would think as boutique firms today.
But at the risk of clouding this discussion with some data, right? The vast majority of architects in this country practice in firms with 7 or fewer people.
Yeah.
And Amy and I, my friend from the business school and I, a couple of years ago, decided we wanted some data about what was happening with our graduates, so we did a survey of the previous 25 years of Yale graduates, and guess what we found out? 78% of them, even though they may have transited through a bigger firm, 78% of our graduates were in their own practices with like 6 or fewer people. And that's where the vast majority of architecture is practiced in this country. Most of the money gets spent by the big firms.
But-
Most of the work happens in the little firms.
More than 50% of the construction value is done by firms of 100 or more.
Exactly.
And more than 50% of the fees get paid to those, you know, it's the 1% thing. But going back to some other things that we talked about, which I found interesting, at least, and that is that George put his finger on very, very wisely in the very beginning. He said, look, there are 2 ways to change things. One is you go from 0 to 1 and you just make a whole different thing, or you keep improving what we've got. And I think that what we're talking about here is a mistake, because what we're talking about is basically improving something that doesn't work. Let's just throw it out altogether and start from scratch, okay? And if you start from scratch, you look at what are the 2 biggest problems we have. The 2 biggest problems we have are, first of all, the separation of designer, fabricator, and owner. You know, so we got to get rid of that separation. Number 1. 2, we suffer from the fact that we put all this work in and it gets done once. This is insane. Can you imagine what kind of a car or a smartphone or anything? You'd have a $100 million smartphone that doesn't work a tenth as well as what you get very cheaply now.
And those 2
you'd have
ideas are completely correlated with one another.
Right,
by the way.
right. And going back to what you said, there seemed to be 3 models for how to improve practice. And then the smartest thing that was said all evening was what you said at the end, is none of them make sense. So let's just scratch all those things and let's start from ground zero and let's say, if you had to reimagine this the way, say, Fred Smith did FedEx, that's where the gold ring is. I mean, it's not even a brass ring, it's a gold ring.
Can I just say, that one of the things that I think would be the whole new thing, because I completely agree, is to get rid of the idea that we're doing piecework. As in, what we're doing is delivering an object, and it's a big piece, it's an expensive piece, but it's piecework.
Well, Elon Musk is delivering an object. Steve Jobs delivered an object. There's nothing wrong with delivering an object.
No.
We're just ridiculously dumb about we're putting all this effort in and we're making one.
I disagree. When they're hiring people, they're not hiring people to make that object. There will be be something that comes out. They're hiring people because they have a certain knowledge and they're seen as bright. They're seen as and so they're hired for knowledge. And basically, Apple then or Mac will be interested in producing other forms of knowledge for us. It isn't that they've preordained that there is going to be that tablet.
But yes, absolutely. And I think all of you have an absolutely brilliant future ahead where you're all going to make a big pile of money, but not doing what we've taught you to do, because that's ridiculous.
You know, that's the big thing. Let me just go this out. The throwing it all out gets you wondering, what do architects do, right? Like, do you go down to the core?
Okay, I'll tell you, David. I'll tell you what we were trained to do at the best way is not what we think of what we do. What we've really been trained to do is, first of all, define a problem. Second of all, come up with alternate solutions. And third of all, figure out which is the best one, most likely to succeed, and then figure out how to make it happen. That's what you've learned how to do. We're applying this fabulous process in a really dumb way.
And there's a reason why the term
turn around and look in the other direction.
Taken over by computer science or by any number of
in my business, the highest position in the software organization is the so-called software architect.
Exactly.
That's the person who's supposed to be able to conceptualize the problem and see the big picture and not have to worry about the details.
One thing I would say is that everything we're talking about, throwing away the system and rethinking it and kind of like, it's fine, but the reality is the majority of the students, like you're saying, are going to end up working in architecture firms. And one of the biggest problems that was identified in our table, and I think Peggy and a few other people brought it up, was the lack of transparency. So, for example, you brought up the military and some of the data, I don't know, Phil loves a lot of that, is data-driven things. But it's very important because what it does is visualize the hidden structure between things. And I truly think that one of the problems with practice today is that we don't actually understand what it is. That practice is this ephemeral thing. We don't know how to we don't like, for example, and I mentioned this, one of the things is I was in the military, I was in the Air Force, and I saw that the rank system is very clear. I know what I need to do to go up or down in rank, And in the civilian world, that does not exist. And it's always, it's promises, it's sacrifice, and it's risk, and all these things, and it may not or may not happen. And which could be fine, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think anyone wants all these things to be super prescribed. But at the very least, we should understand what are some typical ways that these things happen. And because it's still the sacrifice and the failure of what you're talking about, Paul, I think a lot of people can just sacrifice everything, and for a lot of people that failure is not really an option.
But let me just go back. You know, when you mentioned the risk, and the risk being losing the job, that's not the risk. I mean, that is so minuscule. The real risk is you're a practicing architect and something really bad happens in a building you did and you get sued for $10 or $100 million. That's the real risk that we're dealing with, not losing a job. That's puny.
Okay, but
It depends on what skill you are at. That job could be a big deal.
I don't want to be super obsessive about the data here, right? But
You should be. That's exciting.
when you actually look at the realistic probabilities of that $100 million lawsuit and that it's going to come to fruition, meaning you're going to get all the way through the thicket and have to write a $100 million check, it's zero. It's the threat of the lawsuit, not the actual lawsuit itself.
But
So when you look at some of these alternative project delivery models that we're experimenting with now, where there are these liability arrangements where the owner, the architect, and the contractor agree not to sue one another, that statistically wipes 85% of your liability off the table. The other 15% that's out there, which is little old men falling down and breaking their hips sort of stuff, third-party stuff, almost none of that makes it into a courtroom. Almost none of it.
Okay, but the statistic I know of is that every architecture firm gets sued once every 2 years.
No, that's not true.
It is.
Get sued. Get sued.
No, there are.
That's true, I've read that back, yeah.
I mean, at least.
Wait, you read it, so it was true?
Well, maybe you read it. You may have read it in my book.
He's stating.
Oh, you read it in your book.
He's stating actual data, which I asked you before, example of risk, benefacting reward. He's actually listing the actual data.
But okay, but let me, Phil is right. Very few cases actually end up, going to trial and coming to a verdict. So that is true.
There are
very small.
There are about 40 claims. There are about 40 claims active at any given time for every 100 firms that are out there. But that doesn't mean 40 of the 100 firms are involved in the claims. And the definition of a claim is, I'm a client, I'm pissed off, and I called you, and I threatened to go after you. That's the definition of a claim. Not that a lawsuit has been filed.
Well, in any rate, if eventually, pardon me?
This is not addressing a very central issue.
Okay, let's get off this topic. We could spend 3 evenings on this.
There are billions of people organizing over the next 20 years, and the industry actually does need to change. It's not just a matter of preference or making money. The building industry, architecture, everything has to evolve, and how this happens is basically up for grabs.
I agree.
And going off that,
one of the architects will be part of that.
Right, exactly.
I mean, the industry and the individuals working in the industry, I think, are two things that are a little bit separate. And I think that I just want to make sure that we talk about the right skills. For example, a lot of you are probably may not be running the firms that are building those cities. A lot of you might be the workers that are working within those firms to build it, or might be completely outside of it. I just want to make sure that we keep that perspective that we might all just be slightly too young.
Innovation has to come from somewhere, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe practice should be more school-like. Maybe practice should be more school-like instead of the other way around. Because I always heard this thought, we always, in school we always put this, the real world on a kind of pedestal. And we would have practitioners, or maybe I went to IIT, so I have maybe a different context, but practitioners would come in and they would say, well, in the real world it would actually happen like this, and maybe they'd be charitable and say, but that's okay, you're still in school, so it's fine. Or they would be like, no, you need to learn how to do it like we would do it in the real world, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe this is the actual radical proposition, is that we be naive about it, and we be and that practice becomes more academic, and all of these other things. That's the world that I want to see.
Well, that's in fact goes to my point, which is in fact what we're trying to produce is knowledge, and we're not trying to produce an object. an object that we walk away from as soon as the picture's taken. That's not good.
So perhaps,
It's gonna
maybe this is the issue of the fact that no matter how innovative that we get with our industry, that we adapt to a technology industry or startup industry, it's the fact that our industry is just simply, it's just simply so slow to move. I mean, after all, building project just takes so much time. Bureaucracy is involved, building structure, cost, it just simply takes it's an economy of time. That's our industry. I think because of that, we're always playing sort of catch up, right? So I think he just mentioned there's an interesting fact that our industry should be more like in school, but in fact, the technology industry is trying to go in the reverse, right? Industry itself is trying to be more like, the school itself is more trying to be more professional, whereas industry is trying to be more like school. The Google, it operates almost like, large, like a campus. They have pinups, informal work schedules. That's the way they operate. But we're thinking again, we're doing finally a catch-up. By the time we think of it this way, thinking the industry more like school. Again, industry I've already changed. Now going back to
very limited spectrum of two things that already exist, and both should probably change during the conversation.
Google is up to their
We've got
eyeballs
two
in
odd
capital.
models, which one do you want to choose?
We don't have the capital as a profession to do things like Google. So, because there are things that we care about that most people in the world don't care about the things that we care about. So either we have to convince people to care about them and pay for them, and we have more capital to do what we want to do. But none of these things can happen without capital in our system. Unless we could change our political system, we could convince people to pay money for the things that we think are important.
Well, Steve Jobs did that.
I think about
He figured out how to make people care about design, and he took a product, I think it was called the Roxy. It was an MP3 player. It was ugly as ever, and nobody bought it. And he just put it in a better package and marketed it smarter.
If you could take like Steve Jobs and Lou Kahn's DNA and make like
good God, that's horrible.
There must be one in the room.
maybe you could have someone convince people that the things that architects care about are important. But
Phil, I remember reading something of yours from Perspective, and I think the money issue. It's one of my favorite articles ever. It talked about the waste in the construction industry, and so it's not like there's not opportunity to rethink it. Like there's this pent up. I mean, what is it? Productivity over the course of the last 50 years within the construction industry has basically stayed flatlined, right? There's been no actual
Negative in the building industry.
Yeah.
Productivity is negative.
That's one of the most fascinating things that I find, actually, is that, like, as a product manager at a tech firm, it's my job to go and talk to potential markets and ask them, like, essentially ascertain what their pain points are, and then assess a value for alleviating that pain point with technology. And when I look at the building industry, it's $250 billion of productivity lost from that chart, and like 30% of waste. And I'm thinking, no one wants to touch that.
Oh, it's amazing that no one wants to touch that.
Yeah.
I was teaching up at Harvard Business School a couple of years ago, talking about this question. I'm in front of 85, Harvard MBA, soon to be Harvard MBAs, and I put this number up on the board, and it's like $200 billion a year in the U.S. Who wants to go after that? Who's interested in that? There's a shitload of money out there, people. Not one hand in the room. Not one.
It's because the risk in construction is like physical, like a building collapses or something, whereas in tech, my app doesn't work.
It's also a political thing.
Yeah, most of those people are going into finance or real estate
And finance
development.
it's even better because I can screw millions of people.
I don't. The problem looks the problem from the outside looks intractable, but it is a huge economic opportunity. I mean, guys, can I put some numbers on the board here? Please. I just did this with my first year students today. Right here. Okay, so here's some data for you, because this is where I live, right? Okay, so we got about 200,000 butts in seats in architecture firms in the United States. Those are billable people. They're not necessarily all licensed, of which there are 100,000 roughly licensed architects, but that number includes people like Paul and me who have licenses who are not practicing. So that actual number of practitioners is more like, I don't know, I'd say 80-ish thousand, and the other people are off doing other stuff, okay? This group of people was responsible for generating about roughly $350 billion worth of buildings. That's roughly the value of what of the buildings that architects design when the economy is is firing on all cylinders.
Per year.
Per year. 300 to 400 billion. Okay? That same 300 to 400 billion, if we're really lucky, generates about $30 billion in net fees. Net fees means the fees that go to us, not to the engineers and us, just us. Okay? So 350 billion in construction, 30 billion in fees. Okay? So we take the 35% waste factor here on the 350. That number is, I can't do it in my head because I've had 2 beers, but it's like $140 billion. So here's one way for those of us who are teachers on this panel to think about this. We're training a generation of architects who go out and earn $30 billion and participate in a process that then wastes 4 times as much money as is made doing the work. The waste factor is 4x what the fees are. I mean, if that's not a value proposition, I've never seen one before, right? And if you can't capture the 35%, capture 20 and keep 10. I mean, there's plenty of opportunity out there, plenty of opportunity. And this is a deep, deep structural problem. If you look at the productivity charts for the whole rest of the U.S. economy, they look like this in terms of GDP per dollar, per hour of labor produced. And there's a break point about right here, about 1998, right about the time lots of people were buying PCs and all that internet cable got laid between here and Europe, but the building industry numbers go like this. The building industry numbers are negative. So in that gap is that number, and that is a huge, huge value proposition.
What percent of the 350 billion was designed by architects?
All of it. That's the value of buildings. The U.S. construction economy varies between 850 and $1 trillion a year.
I was under the impression a very high percentage of the construction done in this country was not touched by architects.
It's true. There's $1 trillion in construction in this country.
Okay, so this is
that's the value that we design as architects.
Okay.
So look at those numbers, people.
And to talk about like how the outside doesn't yet understand what goes on in construction, see, venture capital itself, which is typically traditional like MBAs that go into it from finance, different types of backgrounds. I also work at a tech company too, and it's interesting to know the very few, let's say VC firms out there that understand the construction industry, that even want to deal with it. They see from the outside and they don't understand it, and so it's very difficult. There's been a change in the past year where like construction tech has like boomed.
Yeah, that's
2015.
because of a bunch of other externalities, at least in my opinion.
Sure, yeah.
That's because of a bunch of other externalities. But look at the construction industry. Messy, right? Involves lots of smelly, complicated things. Dangerous. Corrupt.
Collapse today.
Crane collapse. Corrupt, right? I mean, you know how construction projects work here in New York. You need Uncle Guido from Newark to make sure you got those trucks going on and off the job. And the margins suck. The profit margins are really, really narrow. I mean, William's observation about the lack of capital is a well understood thing in the construction industry. We don't have wide profit margins, so there's no money to innovate. I mean, your description of Steve Jobs, while broadly correct, also needs to remember that his gross margins on those things are 85%. He's making boatloads of money. So he has all the money in the world to spend time redesigning the iPhone 6 box 96 times.
Well, and the other thing is construction is not, somehow construction is like a dirty word in education. How many of you went to what you would consider premier schools that had a department of construction? Nobody, right?
But it's even worse than that. All the people of my generation who are running construction firms now have children. Those children are not doing construction. They're going to architecture school, becoming lawyers and doctors.
Last question maybe here, and then last question for Kiefer, and then someone else.
I'm just very interested in what our goal is at the end, because if you said, like you just maybe 15 minutes ago said to us, you think we're all going to make a boatload of money. You can. We should. We might. Whatever. Regardless, I'm doing the math, and even if it's the 30 billion is divided by 200,000, that's $150,000 per person.
Per year.
per year. That's an insane amount of money for each person to have to live and support a family and yada yada yada. And I think if we're considering, okay, sorry, that's too simple of math, whatever. But if the end goal is that we're all making a shit ton of money, especially if we're all from Harvard or Yale or Columbia, I think it's extremely problematic for us to be striving towards us with a very elite high education being extremely rich and well off, while we make buildings for public housing that are fucked up, or we make buildings that don't support whatever 80-90% of society.
So just really quickly, I think the key number in that is not the 350 billion and the 35%, it's the 200K, right? Because like if we're not talking, like I'm not particularly interested in making more money. Like it's important to me as a measure of like how architecture is valued in society, but like ultimately it's the organizing, the 200K, right? To see the kind of moral and ethical changes in the world that we want to see, that's gonna like, that I'm really motivated by.
What's your definition of value?
Can I just, because it's Friday and because I think this is the the best time to wrap this up, can we have each person maybe respond? I think that's a good wrap-up question. What
is value?
What should we take away from this?
I'll start. I think all this stuff is really just kind of like talk. I mean, in my mind, it's like, you know, if schools produce people or produce students or whatever that go in to become professionals that care about each other in the workplace, that want to be clear and communicate and be very transparent, and actually want and they can figure out how to create firms, even if they're small shops, 7 people, but there's not a high turnover. They care about turnover. They actually care about it. They actually do like exit interviews with people, and they ask them like, why did you want to leave the firm? Like, because I suck. Why do I suck? Tell me the ways. I'll improve. I want to do these things. Those things actually reverberate as a kind of like culture out into how do you want to talk to clients? Do we want to build better relationships with clients? How can we better, clearly as a team, address the lack of clarity that we have with our client and the value proposition we're trying to give them? Can we think about these things holistically as teams? All those things actually kind of come out of a very simple idea, which is like, if we teach people to understand management to some degree, right? Of how to work together as teams, how to work together as people, how to respect each other and provide all these things that are necessary in order to have an effective organization, that will actually give space and room and time maybe to think about how to approach this issue. Because otherwise, you don't have time as an employee to think about this. All you're doing is thinking about, why the fuck am I working here till 12 o'clock at night? I hate this. I thought working for a Starchitect was going to be great, but yeah, I work on really cool projects, but I can't even go home to spend time with my family. I can't, and so this all becomes very real, right? But if you don't start there and demand it even, right? Because you actually have power, which is what you don't realize. You have the power to demand this at the workplace that you go to. And you have the agency to look for these materials outside. Like I had to look for it myself. I think that actually can lead to do this, right? And then it's a win, right?
I think that as a wrap-up conversation about value, etc., I think I agree with some of the comments. The real value here is in the 200K and kind of rethinking. All this is super interesting, I think one of the conversations that happens every time we have these kind of talks is when we're talking about value and for architects, is it value so that we can get paid more, so we can be more entrepreneurial, so we can, or whether our value in society needs to be increased, and that includes maybe rethinking, refiguring, thinking about the reason why we're in the situation we are in. The situation in which before the I think Steve Jobs, all these people really took on the role that some of the architects had in the past. And it's kind of super interesting to think about those parallels, why Steve Jobs is the Corbusier of its time, and there's been a value. One of the problems is that that 35% may never go away because it's a political proposition, like you're saying. Uncle Guido's never going to go away, and there will be other ones because once you start putting things in space, and I think you Occupy Wall Street, politically we've always seen it, once you put things down, negotiations need to happen, and it becomes more about that and the bottom line. And maybe that's actually interesting to think about, that a lot of this money now is going to digital space that is consciously thinking is devoid of any politics, of any of these negotiations and any of these conflicts. I think what we do, if we think about architecture as something that influences physical space, will never leave the negotiation space, and it will always have the waste involved. Okay, however, I think that the real key here is to really, if we value this, to understand what are some of the steps in our profession, allowing them to change. I would urge us to continue to work on that diagram, to think about what is it that we're, and how have we gotten here? How have we gotten to the point that designing a school for the city is getting harder and harder, that a public space is, you can't do it. It's taxation, that the entire system has changed in a radical way. And that there were times that it worked differently, and that we could think about how to do it. So, such as the New Deal.
I guess in this conversation, the thing that I keep thinking about is, what is the agent of change? You know, if we really are going to start over, or if we really are going to invest in or take time to exploit that value proposition, how does that happen? Who will do that? You're bright and you're not doing it, and I'm bright and I'm not doing it. I'm trying to do it. You know, you're trying to do it. AIA is not doing it.
We all have our weak attempts.
Yeah, but part of it is the question of top down and bottom up. You know, part of me thinks like, if we don't vote for Bernie Sanders, it ain't never going to change. You know, and so you really get the politics in the right place, so the engines are right. You know, but the other is that I really have kind of given up on everybody who's practicing now. Totally given up. They're not going to change. They put their dues in, they paid their education, they were fucking interns, now they're owners. Just, it's you guys. It's you guys. It really is going to take another generation, and it means every single time you think about a job, you think about these questions. And if you think that you're putting that decision on hold because you have to go work for a firm, you have to pay back your loans, and so you go work for Bob Stern because he pays really well, you get out of there 10 years after you paid your loans, you won't even remember what you're thinking about. You think about it right now, every day. You guys are the ones. You really have to get going.
Peggy Deamer for president.
I actually completely agree. I think although Peggy, you and I have we've tried lots of different kinds of maneuvers.
No,
probably the most important thing we do is spend time with our students. Because I've been saying this in my classroom for years, and both of you guys heard me say it, right? You were the generation that I was going to have to break this construct. I mean, I agree with Paul that some fundamental things have to happen, but we as a profession are not strong enough to do it by ourselves, but the unique value that we bring to this problem is our sensibility as designers. And we could actually look at the whole context of the problem and design our way through this, because we're getting to a moment in time where all of the conditions are right for a radical change. The construction industry is on the precipice of some kind of big shift. The technology is such that there are big changes possible. If we can create enough of a radicalized group of practitioners who won't accept the status quo, then something can change and something can happen. And it's definitely not going to be these old people sitting up here that do it. But I used to tell my customers, the people that use my software, that in my classroom I was creating a generation of architectural terrorists. Because what I tell my students is go to your office and break shit. Ask questions and break things. Because things don't work very well right now, and that's where you start. Start breaking things.
So I guess it's appropriate that I have the last word, since I am by far, I just found out that I almost have children as old as this guy. I am by far the oldest person in the room. I'm the only one who made it to the end of that diagram about it.
You are here. I don't know what happens out here.
So although I'm lucky and honored honored to still be able to teach after 45 years or so of practice. I've done, I paid my dues there. I would say, what's the goal? The goal is to create wonderful places for everybody that gives them a sense of dignity and uplifts their lives. That's the difference between architecture and construction. And never take your eye off that one, because that's what you all have the power to do. But you will only get to do it if you rethink radically how it's done. And I gave a few possibilities out, but there are dozens of you, and there's only 5 or 6 of us. And you guys are younger and smarter than we are, and so you've got to be the ones to go out and do it. But don't do it by just kind of inching along. Do it by really, as Phil said, break something. So that's what my hope for you is. Thank you.